The day I finally understood what my marriage had always been, I was sitting in a hospital parking garage at 2 in the morning, eating a granola bar over the steering wheel because I hadn't had a real meal in 11 hours. My phone showed 3 missed calls from Clifton and 1 text. "When are you coming home? The dry cleaning needs picking up tomorrow." My mother was upstairs in room 4C, her 3rd round of chemotherapy draining the color out of her skin like a slow tide pulling back from shore. And my husband, a man who had kissed me on the forehead at our wedding and whispered that he would always take care of me, wanted to know about the dry cleaning. I didn't answer that night. I ate the granola bar. I watched the fluorescent lights flicker in the concrete ceiling above me. Something in my chest went very still, the way a pond goes still right before the surface freezes over. I didn't know it yet, but what I was feeling in that parking garage wasn't grief or exhaustion or even anger. It was the beginning of something much colder and much more useful than any of those things. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand where I ended up, you have to understand where I started. And more importantly, you have to understand who I was before I became someone Clifton Vane thought he could buy and manage on a budget. My name is Regina Holloway Vane, though I've gone back to just Holloway now, and I say that with the particular satisfaction of someone who has reclaimed something that was always theirs. I'm 43 years old. I grew up in a 2-bedroom house in Mill Haven, Ohio, the kind of town where everyone knows what you had for breakfast and who your grandmother voted for. My father left when I was 9. Not dramatically, not with a scene, just quietly stopped coming home the way a guest who overstays their welcome eventually remembers they live somewhere else. My mother, June Holloway, raised me alone on a teacher's salary and an extraordinary amount of stubbornness. She made my Halloween costumes from scratch. She drove me to every debate tournament, every college visit, every job interview in cities she'd never been to. She was, in every meaningful sense, my whole family. I became an auditor because numbers made sense to me in a way people often didn't. Numbers were honest. You could lay them out on a page and they would tell you exactly what happened if you knew how to look. I was good at it, methodical, patient, nearly impossible to bluff. I worked for 12 years at a mid-sized accounting firm in Columbus, and I was the person the partners called when something didn't add up. I had an eye for discrepancy. I noticed things. It is one of the bitter ironies of my life that I exercised this skill every day at work and somehow managed to leave it entirely at the office when I came home. I met Clifton Vane at a charity fundraiser for the Children's Hospital, the kind of event where everyone is dressed too expensively and the crab cakes are very small. He was 41, a senior director at a pharmaceutical logistics firm with the kind of jawline that photographs well and a way of giving you his complete attention when you talked that felt at the time like a gift. He asked me questions about my work. He remembered my answers. He called the next day. He was thoughtful and consistent and, I told myself, the opposite of my father in every measurable way. We dated for 2 years. He was attentive in that period, in the way some people are attentive when they are building something. Purposeful, focused, occasionally checking a box I didn't know existed. I chalked the slight sense of calculation up to the fact that he was a detail-oriented person. So was I. I thought that made us compatible. He proposed at a restaurant I'd mentioned offhandedly 4 months earlier, which he had remembered and booked and arranged with a ring I'd described in a jewelry store window on a Sunday walk I'd thought was spontaneous. It was romantic, and it was also, I realize now, a demonstration of research capability more than love. But I said yes. I was 38, my mother was healthy then, the light that night was very golden, and I wanted to believe I had found what I'd been looking for. The prenuptial agreement arrived 3 weeks before the wedding, delivered by his attorney in a folder embossed with the firm's name. It was 27 pages long. Clifton handed it to me over dinner with the same expression he used when presenting quarterly reports: mild, certain, slightly impatient for agreement. "It's just standard," he said, refilling his wine. "Everybody does this now. My attorney drafted it, yours should review it, but honestly, it's boilerplate." I looked at it. I didn't look at it enough. I was finishing the arrangements for a wedding for 140 people, managing a major audit at work, and the document was 27 pages of dense legal language, and I trusted him. I skimmed it. My attorney, a friend of a friend who owed me a favor and wasn't a matrimonial specialist, said the language was, quote, "pretty standard." I signed. I found out what was actually in it 14 months later, sitting in a different attorney's office, watching a specialist in family law read through it with the expression of someone who has seen a car accident from a distance and is relieved it wasn't them. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. The first 2 years of our marriage were what I would describe as functional. We had a 3-bedroom apartment in a good part of the city. It was in Clifton's name, purchased before the wedding with his money, and the prenup made clear it remained his asset. My salary went into our joint account. So did his, nominally, though he managed the finances, and I was given a monthly amount he called household funds that covered groceries, my personal expenses, and the gym membership I used 3 mornings a week to maintain the specific kind of composure you develop when you're not entirely sure your life is going in the right direction. I told myself the arrangement made sense. He earned more, he was better with money, I was busy. These are the things you tell yourself. Clifton's mother, Dolores Bain, was a retired insurance adjuster who lived in a large house in the suburbs and maintained a social life of extraordinary intensity for a woman of 71. She had bridge club on Mondays, a church volunteer committee on Wednesdays, and a rotating roster of friends she referred to collectively as my girls, as though they were backup singers. She was thin and impeccably groomed and had a way of looking at you that suggested she was calculating something about you that you hadn't disclosed. She liked Clifton in the fierce, slightly competitive way some women like their sons, as extensions of themselves, as proof of their own excellence. She tolerated me the way you tolerate a piece of furniture that came with an apartment you didn't choose. On holidays, she would press gifts on me: a cashmere scarf, a cookbook, a particularly nice candle, with great ceremony, and each time I thanked her, she would nod with an expression of gracious beneficence, as though she were distributing aid to a small, grateful nation. I thought she was simply performing generosity for an audience. I had no idea she was keeping receipts. Literally. She also kept a parrot. His name was Gerald, a large African gray with the vocabulary of a sulky uncle and the emotional range of a morning talk show. Gerald lived in a wrought iron cage in Dolores's living room and had opinions about everyone who came through the front door. He announced arrivals. He repeated phrases with uncanny accuracy. He had, over a decade and a half of living with Dolores, absorbed her conversational habits so completely that sometimes, when you weren't looking at the cage, you couldn't be entirely sure who was talking. My mother liked Gerald. She thought he was funny. My mother, June Holloway, had a capacity for finding humor in things I found simply bizarre, which was one of the gifts she gave me that I didn't appreciate properly until later. The first year of the marriage, June visited twice. She was small and energetic, with silver hair she wore in a practical braid and a handshake that surprised people. She and Clifton were cordial in the way of people who have a mutual interest in the same person and no particular interest in each other. He called her June, she called him Clifton. They were polite. When she left after the second visit, she called me from the road and said, "He's very organized, your husband," which, coming from my mother, was not quite a compliment. I had a friend named Margot Finch who lived 12 minutes away by car, which in our suburb meant she was my closest geographic ally. Margot was a landscape architect with short, gray-streaked hair she kept in a blunt cut and a gift for identifying what was actually wrong with the situation in the time it took most people to understand what the situation was. We had met at a neighborhood association meeting 3 years earlier, united by the shared experience of watching the association president explain a parking proposal for 45 minutes using hand-drawn diagrams, and had been friends since. Margot and I belonged to a small watercolor painting group. There were 5 of us at peak attendance, though realistically it was me, Margot, and 2 women named Sylvia Crane and Pat Odom, who came regularly, and a 5th member named Dee, who came when her schedule permitted and once painted an entire abstract seascape in the wrong colors and called it intentional. We met every other Thursday evening at someone's house, spread newspapers across the dining room table, opened a bottle of wine, and painted with the concentrated ineptitude of people who took up a hobby for their mental health and discovered, somewhat to their surprise, that they actually enjoyed it. It was at one of these evenings, about 18 months into my marriage, that Margot looked at me sideways while cleaning her brush and said, "You seem tired." "I'm fine," I said. "You painted the house gray 3 times, and you're still painting it gray." I looked at my paper. I had been, in fact, rendering my own house in progressively darker shades of gray for 40 minutes. "It's atmospheric," I said. Margot refilled my wine without asking if I wanted more. That's the kind of friend she was. My mother's diagnosis came on a Tuesday in October, delivered over the phone by a doctor with a measured, professional voice, while I was at my desk reviewing a discrepancy in a client's expense account. Breast cancer. Stage 2, but aggressive. They wanted to begin treatment within 2 weeks. I wrote everything down in the notebook I kept open on my desk, because my hand needed to be doing something while my brain adjusted to the information. I called Clifton immediately. He was in a meeting, but picked up. "That's rough," he said. There was the sound of him stepping away from something. "What does she need?" "Surgery first, then probably chemo." The doctor said, "Is she covered? Medicare?" "Yes, but she'll need help. Someone needs to be with her through Regina." His voice was patient in the way of a person explaining something they've explained before. "I know this is hard, but she has her own life, her own situation. I'm sure she has friends, people who can help. You can visit on weekends." I sat with the phone in my hand in my quiet office and listened to what he wasn't saying, which was considerably louder than what he was. "Try to sort it out," he said. "You'll figure it out. It's your mother." He went back to his meeting. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time. Then I booked a flight to Millhaven. What followed was 91 days in which I learned everything there is to know about chemotherapy waiting rooms. The smell of the antiseptic, that particular clean chemical smell that is aggressive in its neutrality, that says whatever was here before has been eliminated. The acoustic quality of corridors where people are trying to be quiet, where every sound is dampened by good intentions and institutional carpet, where footsteps are softer than they should be and voices carry anyway. The way light looks in hospital rooms at 5 a.m, when you've been there since the previous afternoon, when the night nurses change to day nurses and a new shift begins moving through the halls with the purposeful, slightly cheerful energy of people who have slept and eaten, while you sit in a vinyl chair that has been slept in by too many worried people and holds their particular residue of anxiety, and you look at the ceiling tiles and count the water stains, and listen to your mother breathe. She was braver than I had expected, and also more afraid than she allowed anyone to see, except me, in the night hours when the ward was quieter and the pain medication had worn down to the edge of its effectiveness, and she was too tired to maintain the brisk, practical persona she deployed during the day for the benefit of the nurses and the other patients in the hall. At 3 in the morning, in the particular vulnerability of that hour, she would hold my hand and not say much, and I would hold hers and not say much either, and we would simply be there together, in the way of people who have been in the same weather for a long time and no longer need to narrate it. During the day, she was formidable. She complained about the food with the specificity of someone who had cooked well for 40 years and considered institutional cuisine a form of personal affront. The oatmeal was paced with ambitions. The chicken was theoretically chicken. When a well-meaning nutritionist came in on the 3rd week with a pamphlet about eating well during treatment, my mother looked at her over the reading glasses she'd started wearing after the first round of medication and said, very politely, "Thank you. I'll read this when they bring something edible." The nutritionist left looking slightly diminished. She terrorized the nursing staff about scheduling with such consistency and good humor that within 2 weeks most of them were scheduling around her preferences anyway, and the charge nurse told me privately that June Holloway was her favorite patient on the floor because she was the only one who complained about the right things in a way that was actually useful. I thought about my mother young, the woman who had driven to 6 different cities for my debate tournaments, who had made Halloween costumes from scratch, who had worked a teacher's schedule and maintained a home and raised a daughter alone without ever once suggesting that any of this was hard. And I thought, of course she's their favorite. She has been managing impossible situations her entire adult life. I stayed in her house. I slept in my old bedroom, which she had turned into a guest room but still contained the bookshelf from my childhood, the particular set of paperbacks I had loved at 15, a framed photo on the dresser of the 2 of us at my college graduation that I hadn't seen in years. I drove her to every appointment. I sat in the waiting rooms with a book I rarely managed to read for more than 2 pages at a time, watching the other families, the husbands with their hands clasped between their knees, the adult children who drove down from other cities the way I had, the occasional person who came alone and sat very still and looked at their phone. I held the basin when she was sick, and I held her hand when she was scared. And I told her every day that she was going to be fine, with the specific conviction of someone who has decided that no alternative is permissible. At night, after she was settled and the evening medication had taken hold, I would sit at her kitchen table with my laptop and whatever was left of the day's coffee and do the work I'd been able to carry remotely, auditing files, emails, reports, and the familiar language of numbers and figures was a comfort in that period in a way that surprised me. Numbers didn't have opinions. They didn't send fruit baskets. They simply were what they were, and they would tell you what had happened if you looked carefully enough. And there was something almost restful in that honesty after 2 years of learning to interpret Clifton's particular vocabulary of deflection and control. My mother did not ask about him much. She asked once in the 2nd week, while I was helping her change into fresh clothes after a bad morning, and the question was simple. "Has he called?" I told her yes, he called twice a week. She nodded and said nothing else. That silence was, as I said, its own kind of verdict. She had been reading Clifton for longer than I had. She had simply respected my right to reach my own conclusions. One evening in the 5th week, she was having a good day. Energy up, appetite returning, the particular brightness in her eyes that came when the medication was working and her body was fighting back. And we sat on her back porch in the October cold with blankets over our legs and she told me about a student she'd had 20 years ago who had gone on to teach himself. She told it the way she told most stories, with precision and humor and a clear sense of where she was going, with the small satisfactions of a person who has lived carefully and paid attention and accumulated a rich record of interesting things. I listened and thought, she is going to be fine. She is going to be exactly fine. And the conviction of it sat in my chest like a stone that had finally found solid ground. I stayed in her house. I drove her to appointments. I held the basin when she was sick, and I held her hand when she was scared. And I told her every day that she was going to be fine, with the specific conviction of someone who has decided that no alternative is permissible. Clifton did not visit. He called twice a week briefly. He sent a fruit basket through a delivery service, the kind where you can enter a message and it arrives looking impersonal and sufficient. The card said, "Thinking of you, Clifton and Regina." My mother read it, looked at me, and said nothing, which was its own kind of verdict. What Clifton did do during those 91 days was transfer $40,000 to his mother's account for a kitchen renovation she had been planning. I know this because I was still nominally managing some of the household finances from my laptop at my mother's kitchen table, and the transfer appeared in the joint account statement with a memo that said, "Mom Kitchen." $40,000. While I was asking him whether we could cover the cost of a private nursing aide for 2 days a week so my mother could sleep without worrying, he said the budget was tight. I looked at the transfer. I looked at the statement. My mother was asleep in the next room, her breathing steady but shallow, and the linoleum in her kitchen was peeling at one corner because she'd never gotten around to fixing it. And Clifton's mother was getting new cabinetry. I closed the laptop. I went to the bathroom, sat on the edge of the tub, and breathed very carefully for about 5 minutes. The bathroom was pink. My mother had never gotten around to repainting it from the 70s color scheme, and I had teased her about it for years. The grout was clean. The soap dish was ceramic with a small blue flower. These details were very clear to me in that moment, the way details get clear when the larger picture has become temporarily too large to take in. A pink bathroom, a blue flower, $40,000 for kitchen cabinetry. Then I opened the laptop again, and I started a new file. I named it, without particular drama, documentation. I created folders, financial records, the statement showing the transfer, the household fund history, the joint account figures month by month for the past year. Communications, a selection of texts and emails from Clifton about my mother's illness that I had kept without entirely knowing why, that now read with a clarity I found chilling. Personal, the notes I was beginning to write from memory, dates, conversations, patterns I had noticed and rationalized and would no longer be rationalizing. I had spent 12 years as an auditor. I knew how to organize documentation. I knew what to save and what to look for and how to build a record that would tell a coherent story to anyone who needed to read it. I knew the difference between a discrepancy that was error and a discrepancy that was intent. I knew how to distinguish the chaotic from the deliberate. And what I was looking at in the careful structure of our joint finances, in the 2 calls a week schedule and the fruit basket and the $40,000 and the managed monthly allowance and the carefully limited access, what I was looking at was not chaos. It was architecture. I don't know if I was thinking about divorce at that point. Consciously, I think I was still in denial about how bad things were. But some professional part of me had recognized a discrepancy, and that part had quietly, efficiently begun to gather receipts. My mother knocked on the bathroom door at 10:30 and asked if I was all right. And I said yes, I was just on a call. And she said, "All right," and went to bed. I sat at her kitchen table until nearly 2 in the morning, cross-referencing. The nighttime sounds of her neighborhood, a dog somewhere, the occasional car, the settling of an old house around me, were very ordinary and very steady, and I worked in them with the particular focus of someone who has been given, finally, a problem she knows how to solve. Margot called me on a Friday night, 3 weeks into my mother's treatment. I was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold and a pile of insurance paperwork. "Tell me how she is," Margot said. "Better today. The second round knocked her sideways, but she's bouncing back faster than the doctor expected. She's stubborn. It's genetic." She managed to argue with 3 different nurses about visiting hours. God, I love her. How are you? I'm fine. Regina, I'm tired and I'm angry and I painted nothing for 3 weeks and my husband has visited 0 times. A pause. 0. 0. Another pause, longer this time. I heard Margot's cat doing something to something in the background. Sylvia asked about you at the last session. Pat painted you a little watercolor of some sunflowers. It's terrible. She's still working on her yellows, but it's very sweet. I told them you were handling things. I am handling things. I know. That's what worries me. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. We stayed on the phone for another hour, Margot telling me about a landscaping project she was finishing and a neighbor dispute she'd accidentally mediated, and the watercolor session where Dee had shown up with 3 bottles of wine instead of 1, and the results had been, artistically, memorable. By the time we hung up, I felt, if not better, then at least less alone, which is a different thing and sometimes more important. When I came home, 91 days after I left, my mother was in remission. Not victory. Remission is cautious, provisional, a word that means, for now, the war is paused. But her doctor used words like responding well and positive trajectory, and I drove back to the city with my mother's stubbornness sitting somewhere in my sternum, like a compass needle, finally finding north. Clifton met me at the apartment with a bottle of wine and dinner from the good Italian place on the corner. And for a few hours, it almost felt like before. We didn't talk about the 91 days in any meaningful way. He asked how she was. I said better. He said, "Good, that's great," and poured more wine. And I watched him across the table and tried to find my way back to the feeling I'd had before, the belief that he was attentive, that he remembered things, that the organization of his attention was a form of love. What I felt instead was the linoleum peeling in my mother's kitchen, the $40,000 for the cabinetry, the fruit basket card that said, Clifton and Regina. I smiled and ate the pasta, but I kept the file. The weeks after my return were quiet in the specific way of a house where something has shifted, but nobody has named it yet. I went back to work. I went back to the watercolor evenings. I went back to the routines. But something in me had reorganized, like furniture moved 3 inches. Everything looked the same, but I kept walking into edges. At work, I was sharper than I had been. My colleagues noticed, though they said nothing except that I seemed very focused, which in audit work is a compliment. I was auditing a mid-sized manufacturing client at the time, and I found 3 irregularities in their accounts receivable that their own internal team had missed for 18 months. My senior partner said I had a particular gift for finding things that were arranged to not be found. I thanked him and thought about the joint account statement with its memo line, Mom, Kitchen. I went to the gym 3 mornings a week, as I always had, and I ran on the treadmill until my lungs burned clean. And I thought about things that needed thinking about in the particular methodical way that physical exertion permits. I thought about the prenuptial agreement. I thought about the attorney I needed to consult. I thought about what the next 60 days needed to look like. I didn't think about how I felt, because how I felt was a complex and somewhat overwhelming subject. And I had learned over 12 years of audit work that the most efficient approach to overwhelming subjects is to break them into sequential components and address them one at a time. Clifton, for his part, behaved as though my return from 91 days of crisis was simply the return of a variable element to its expected position. He was pleasant. He asked how the work transition was going. He made dinner reservations at a place we both liked. He did not ask about my mother in any detail that would have required him to know details about her treatment that he didn't already know from the brief calls, which was to say, very few details. When I mentioned that she'd had a good scan result, he said, "Great, that's great news," and went back to his phone. I looked at him across the restaurant table and thought about what the word great sounds like when said by a person for whom it means exactly nothing. I kept the file. I added to it in small increments, carefully, the way you add entries to a ledger, dated, specific, without editorial comment. The record would speak for itself. Records always do if you know how to build them. At the first watercolor Thursday after my return, Sylvia pressed Pat's sunflower painting into my hands the moment I walked through the door. And Pat said, "I tried to get the yellow right. I really did. I know they look slightly orange." And Margot was already opening wine, and the newspaper was spread on the table, and I sat down and felt something loosen in my chest that had been very tight for a very long time. "How's the husband?" Sylvia asked. Sylvia had a way of asking about Clifton that managed to be perfectly neutral and slightly suspicious simultaneously, the way a doctor asks about your diet. "Fine," I said. Said Sylvia, which was not quite a word. "He sent a fruit basket," Margot said, without looking up from her palette. "Margot," I said. "A fruit basket," Pat repeated, with the particular tone of a woman who has been married for 30 years and knows exactly what that means. "It was a very good basket," I said. "There were those little chocolate-dipped strawberries." "Oh, well, chocolate strawberries," Margot said. "That changes everything." We painted for 3 hours. I did not paint gray houses. I did do an extremely ambitious lily pad arrangement that was objectively mediocre and felt nonetheless like progress. 3 months after I came home, I found the notebook. I was not looking for it. That's important. I was not snooping. I was cleaning out a closet shelf to reorganize our winter storage, the kind of domestic task that feels productive and requires no mental engagement, which in that period was its own form of relief. I had boxes of Clifton's old business files that needed resorting, and I was working through them methodically, and I found a small green notebook tucked behind a stack of manila folders toward the back of the shelf. It was small enough to have been missed in any casual look. I almost put it back. It looked like a notebook of meeting notes or a personal journal, and I had no interest in either. Then I noticed my name on the first page in handwriting I recognized as Dolores's. Precise, right-leaning, slightly too controlled, the handwriting of a woman who had been told as a child that penmanship indicated character and had believed it. I sat down on the closet floor. My back was against the wall of hanging coats. The overhead light was a bare bulb on a pull string, and it cast a very flat light across everything, the kind of light that shows exactly what's there without mercy or ambiguity. I opened the notebook. It was a ledger. Dolores had been keeping accounts, not her own household accounts, ours, or more specifically, accounts of everything she had ever given me, itemized and dated, going back to before the wedding. The silk scarf at our first Christmas, $340. The cookbook the following Easter, $85. The earrings she'd pressed into my hands at some point in the second year with such ceremony I'd felt vaguely uncomfortable, $220. A cashmere cardigan, $175. A decorative bowl she'd described as from my travels, $130. A candle set, $45. A cookbook, second one, $60. Below each item, in a different colored pen that she'd apparently used for annotation, she had written small evaluative notes. Didn't write a proper thank you note, card only. Wore the earrings once, check. Returned the scarf? Doesn't wear scarves, investigate. Cardigan, seemed genuinely pleased, promising. The annotations were, in their precision, their judgmental attention, their implied surveillance, more revealing than the ledger itself. She had been watching me with the focused attention of someone assessing an investment. Every item had been a probe, and every reaction had been filed. The total at the back, updated as recently as 3 months ago, while I had been in Millhaven managing my mother's chemotherapy, came to just over $12,000. At the top of the last page, in her most careful handwriting, underlined twice, she had written, "Debt outstanding. Management of Clifton's household expectations." I sat on the closet floor with the notebook in my hands and looked at that phrase for a very long time. Management of Clifton's household expectations. Not gifts given, not even amounts owed. Management. As though my primary function in the architecture of this family had been to keep a specific man's preferences adequately served, and she was keeping track of her contribution to that operational goal, and the debts she had accrued were debts in that project, not debts from one person to another. I thought about every time Dolores had pressed a gift on me, every ceremony of giving, the slight expectation in her face, the waiting to see whether I was grateful in the correct proportion. I had thought she was performing generosity. She had been conducting audits. She had been managing an investment. And she had been keeping better records than I had. The closet smelled of cedar and old paper. The light through the small window above the shelves was very white and very flat. I sat on the floor of that closet for a long time, the notebook in my hands, my thumb running over the edge of the pages, and I thought about the word debt, about management, about the phrase Clifton's household, not our household, his. Then I took it to the kitchen table, photographed every page with my phone, all 32 pages, front and back, and put it back exactly where I'd found it, behind the manila folders at the same angle. Then I made a call I should have made years earlier. Her name was Ellen Marsh, and she was a partner at a family law firm that one of my colleagues had used in a divorce the previous year. She came highly recommended. She was also, as I would discover, extremely good at reading documents. She had started her career in corporate litigation and had the document instincts of a person who had spent a decade finding what contracts didn't say. She was going to be worth every cent of her retainer, which was considerable, and which I paid from a personal savings account I'd been quietly maintaining for 3 years out of a professional habit of financial independence that Clifton had found eccentric and never tried to access. I didn't tell Clifton I had consulted an attorney. I didn't tell him about the notebook I went back to our routines with the same slightly hollow calm I'd maintained since coming back from my mother's. And I waited, and I kept adding to the file. The credit discovery came 6 weeks later. I was doing what I sometimes did in the evenings, working through our finances for my own records, a habit Clifton found eccentric and didn't try to stop. Perhaps because he trusted that my participation in our financial picture was limited to what he chose to show me. He did not know about all of the accounts I had access to. He did not know specifically that I had access to the secondary joint account, an older account we'd opened in the early months of our marriage and that Clifton had largely stopped using, treating it as a dormant legacy account while he consolidated our household finances through the primary account he controlled. For some reason, the automated statement still arrived at an email address I controlled, a detail of financial administration he had apparently not tracked, or perhaps had not thought to track, because he had not considered me a threat. It was a Tuesday night. Clifton was in the study. I was at the kitchen table with a glass of water and my laptop, and I had opened the secondary account statements as part of my routine review. I had checked this account before. It was usually empty of activity, a few small automated transfers. I was not expecting to find anything. On that statement, from 11 months earlier, there was a line item I had never seen before. A transfer out. Not to Dolores's kitchen account. I knew that one by now. It had its own entry in my documentation file under the heading Assets Directed to Third Parties. This was a different account number. The amount was $180,000. The memo field said, Personal Loan C. My water glass was on the table beside the laptop. I put both hands flat on the table, an instinct I sometimes had when I found a number that didn't belong, a grounding gesture, a way of being very present with what I was looking at. $180,000 transferred 11 months ago to an account I didn't recognize, with my name on the authorization. I looked at the authorization document attached to the statement. My name. My signature. I had never signed that document. I knew my own signature. I had been signing my name in a specific way for 30 years, a habit of the pen that had been consistent enough that I could have reproduced it blindfolded. The signature on that document had the right letters in approximately the right order. It had been done carefully by someone who had practiced it, perhaps from other documents, the mortgage, a joint tax return, something I had signed in the ordinary course of our shared life. It was a good forgery, in the sense that it would pass a casual inspection. It was not good enough to pass a careful one. My hands were very steady. That surprised me. I had expected to feel something dramatic, a dropping sensation, a rush of heat, the physical experience of a world shifting. Instead, I felt the same thing I felt when I found a discrepancy in a client's books. A focused, almost professional calm. A click. The sound, internal, of a puzzle piece that was the wrong shape being replaced by the right one. I photographed the statement. I photographed the authorization document. I cross-referenced the destination account number against everything else in my documentation file. And then I sent an email to Ellen Marsh at 11:17 in the evening. I remember the time because I noted it in the file, with the statement and the authorization document attached and a single line of text. I need to discuss signature verification. She responded at 6:40 the following morning, which told me that she had been checking her email early and that the subject line had gotten her attention. Call me at 8. This is important. The call lasted 90 minutes. Ellen had a document examiner she worked with regularly. She was very calm about it, the way professionals are calm about things that would send most people to pieces, because they have seen the category of thing before and know what to do. She explained what a forensic signature analysis involved, what the legal implications of a forged authorization on a loan of that size were, and what, practically speaking, the next steps look like. She used words like criminal exposure and potential charges in the same measured voice she might use to describe a property assessment. I appreciated that. I took notes. I found out 2 days later, through Ellen's preliminary research, that the $180,000 had gone to Clifton's sister, Brenda, a woman I had met 4 times, who was pleasant in an abstracted way and had, I now understood, a commercial property acquisition that her brother had funded using money that was nominally as much mine as his. Clifton had signed his portion of the authorization and had signed mine as well, and the money had moved, and 11 months had passed in which I had known nothing about it, because the statement had gone to an account he'd forgotten I could access. He had made one small error in a very large plan, but small errors for an auditor are how everything begins. I didn't tell Clifton I had consulted an attorney. I didn't tell him about the notebook. I went back to our routines with the same slightly hollow calm I'd maintained since coming back from my mother's, and I waited, and I kept adding to the file. Margot, what's wrong? Not a question. I need you to hear something. I told her, all of it, the notebook, the transfer, the signature. I told her in order, the way I would have organized a presentation for a client, because that was the only way I knew to make it make sense. Margot listened without interrupting, which was not her natural mode. When I was done, there was a long silence. Regina, he forged your signature on a $180,000 loan. Yes. That is, I want to be precise. That is a crime. I'm aware. What are you going to do? I have an attorney. I have documentation. I have a plan. I paused. I also have to figure out the right timing. What does timing look like? It looks like waiting until I have everything in place. The financial forensics, the signature analysis, the prenup review. Ellen thinks there's a challenge to the prenup on the grounds that I wasn't properly advised before signing. I need 30 to 60 days to get everything assembled. Another pause. I could hear Margot thinking. You know what I was going to say? What? I was going to say we should ice him out of the watercolor group. Get Sylvia to make it socially uncomfortable, but that feels like maybe undershooting the situation. Marginally, yes. Okay. Her voice settled into something steadier. What do you need? To not feel like I'm going insane. You're not going insane. You're going through something that would make most people go insane, and you're being spectacularly methodical about it, which is slightly unnerving, but also very you. I leaned my head back against the headrest. The gas station lights were very bright in the dark. A man was filling his tank at the next pump, looking at his phone, completely ordinary. Margot. Yes. He said it was my mother's problem. 91 days. I know. He sent a fruit basket. I know. Okay, I said. Okay, I'm going home. Regina, are you safe there? I thought about it genuinely. Yes, he's not dangerous. He's just, I searched for the word, transactional. Okay. A pause. Come to Thursday. Bring your good brushes. We're doing still life. Pat found a ceramic vase she's very excited about. I'll be there. And Regina, when this is over, I'm taking you somewhere with very good wine, and we are not going to paint anything. The following weeks, I moved through my life with a precision I had never brought to anything except my work. I was calm at home. I made dinner. I asked Clifton about his day. I painted watercolors on Thursday evenings, and the paintings got very good during that period. Margot said later it was the most focused she'd ever seen me, artistically, and she thought it was because I had stopped caring about the outcome and was only thinking about the process. Maybe. Or maybe it was just the cleanest, most honest thing I was doing at the time. Ellen Marsh had assembled a team. The prenuptial agreement, reviewed by a specialist, had problems. The relevant issue was that the agreement contained provisions that were so one-sided and had been signed under circumstances that a court could interpret as inadequate independent legal counsel that there was a viable challenge to its enforceability. Not guaranteed, but viable. More importantly, the forged signature on the loan authorization was not a civil matter. That was criminal. Ellen was working with a forensic document examiner and had contacted the relevant authorities about what came next. My mother called me every Sunday. She was doing well. Her remission was holding, her energy was returning. She had started a small garden in the back of her house with aggressive intentions toward tomatoes. I didn't tell her what was happening. She would have worried, and she needed her energy for the tomatoes. The call from Clifton came on a Thursday evening in March while I was setting up for watercolor night at my house. He called 3 times in a row, which he didn't usually do. I answered on the third call. "My mother fell," he said. His voice was tight in a specific way I'd heard before, the tightness of inconvenience, not grief. "Broke her ankle. She's at home. She's been seen, but she needs someone with her." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said. I was laying newspaper across my dining room table. "Is she in a lot of pain?" "She's managing, but Regina, she can't be alone. She needs someone to stay with her, at least for the first couple of weeks, maybe longer." I straightened up. I looked at my dining room table, at the neat spread of newspapers, at the water jars I'd filled and set at each place, at my brushes in their roll. "She has friends," I said. "Her girls from Bridge Club." "Regina," the patience in his voice was stretched thin. "This is serious. She needs actual care. She can't walk on it. She needs help with meals, with—" "Clifton," my voice was very even. "I understand the situation. When my mother was sick, I managed 91 days of treatment and recovery. You didn't visit once. You said it was my problem to figure out." I paused. One beat. "I'm sure you'll figure it out. It's your mother." Complete silence. I could hear him breathing. I could hear, distantly, the sound of Gerald the parrot saying something in the background that I couldn't quite make out. "What does that mean?" "It means exactly what you said to me 2 years ago, word for word." That was different. Your mother is in Ohio. My mother is—" "Clifton." I sat down. My voice was level. "I've retained an attorney. You should know that. We'll be serving papers next week. I'd recommend you speak to someone before then." The silence that followed was a different quality of silence, the kind that comes when a person is recalculating and finding the numbers don't work. "What?" "Ellen Marsh, family law. She's excellent. I'll have her office send over the initial documentation." I paused. "Also, and you should know this before it comes from someone else, the loan authorization from November 2 years ago has been flagged. The signature on my portion of the document has been examined by a forensic specialist. You should add a criminal attorney to your list." I heard a sound that might have been the chair in his home office, a small, specific sound of someone sitting down very suddenly. "Regina, good night, Clifton." I hung up. Margot arrived 14 minutes later with 2 bottles of wine and Pat's ceramic vase, and I said, "I just told him." And Margot put the bottles on the counter and put her arms around me, and I stood there in my kitchen in the smell of cork and cold night air from the open door and breathed. "Good," Margot said. "Good." The papers were served the following Tuesday. By Wednesday, Clifton had hired 2 attorneys. By Thursday, his mother was calling my phone every 2 hours, which I screened, and then she started calling Margot, which was an interesting strategic choice given that Margot described their conversations to me as educational. She's very creative with the concept of blame. I did not go to Dolores's house. I did not respond to her calls. What I did do was file the police report about the loan authorization, with the forensic document examiner's report attached. Ellen filed the prenup challenge simultaneously. Clifton's attorneys sent a letter offering a settlement significantly better than the prenup terms, a sure sign that they were worried about the prenup challenge and very worried about the criminal investigation. We didn't take the first offer. We went back. 4 weeks after I served papers, I drove out to Dolores's house for what would be the last time. Not because I had to, because Ellen thought it would be productive for me to retrieve some personal items from a visit early in the marriage during which Dolores had offered to store a bracelet that had been my grandmother's. I had agreed at the time, which in retrospect I recognize as a useful lesson about allowing Dolores Vane to hold anything of mine. Clifton was not there. Dolores answered the door in a boot cast, leaning on a cane, with the specific expression of a person who has decided this confrontation is beneath them, but is going to have it anyway. We sat in her living room, Gerald's cage in the corner, the white February light coming in through the curtains. Dolores poured tea she had clearly prepared for this occasion, the good cups, the small plates, and looked at me across the coffee table with her calculating eyes. "I'd like you to understand," she said, "what you're doing to this family." "I'm retrieving my grandmother's bracelet," I said, "and I'd like the notebook." A slight pause. Her hand on the teacup didn't move. "I don't know what notebook you mean." "Green cover, your handwriting, itemized list of gifts to me, running total of $12,000 and some dollars. The notation about debt outstanding for management of Clifton's household expectations." I paused. "I photographed every page. I just want the original." From the cage, Gerald made a sound. Not words, just a throaty, considering murmur that sounded somehow like agreement. Dolores set down her teacup. "You were never what he needed," she said. "You were always difficult. He deserved someone who would..." "Who would what?" I said. "Not notice?" Her face went through several expressions in quick succession, like a slideshow of feelings she hadn't intended to have publicly. Then Gerald spoke, clearly, in Dolores's voice, her precise, right-leaning vocal cadence. He said, "She signed it. She just doesn't know what she signed." The room was very quiet. I looked at the cage. Gerald ruffled his feathers and looked back at me with the ancient, completely amoral gaze of a creature that repeats what it hears and has no opinion about the consequences. Dolores had gone the color of the teacup, white with a little blue around the edges. I put my teacup down. I stood up. I looked at her for a long moment. "The notebook," I said, "and the bracelet. Please." She got them. We didn't speak again. As I was leaving, Gerald said very clearly, "Thank you for coming," which was, under the circumstances, the funniest thing anyone had said in months. I sat in my car in Dolores's driveway for a moment, the notebook in my bag and the bracelet on my wrist, and I looked at the immaculate front yard, the carefully trimmed hedges, the seasonal wreath on the door, the general appearance of a life assembled to look correct from the outside. And I thought about the word she'd used, difficult. I thought about what that word meant coming from her. I thought it probably meant you noticed things. You kept records. You could not be managed. I started the car and drove away. The settlement took another 6 weeks to reach. During those 6 weeks, I slept in the apartment, which I had legal right to occupy pending the proceedings, while Clifton stayed at a hotel and then at his mother's. My attorney and his attorneys negotiated. The prenuptial agreement was challenged on the grounds of inadequate independent legal counsel, and Clifton's side evidently advised that a court fight would be expensive, risky, and potentially made much more complicated by the concurrent criminal investigation into the forged signature, agreed to terms that bore very little resemblance to what the prenup had originally outlined. I kept the apartment, not because I particularly wanted it. I found I wanted very little that had been part of our shared life, but because it was mine by any fair accounting of the money I had put into our household for 5 years. The contested loan of $180,000 was established as Clifton's personal liability. His sister's property deal was, very quietly, restructured. The criminal matter was referred for prosecution. I was told by Ellen that given the amount and the circumstances, Clifton would likely face charges. I chose not to follow that closely. I had spent enough of my focus on Clifton Vane. The night the settlement was finalized, I drove to Margot's house. She had a bottle of something good she'd been saving, she said, for a specific occasion. What occasion? I asked. This one. I bought it the week you told me about the notebook. I had a feeling. We sat at her kitchen table and drank very good wine, and she showed me the watercolor she'd been working on, a study of her garden in early spring, the plants still bare, but the light doing interesting things. It was the best thing she'd ever painted. I told her so, and she said, I know. I finally stopped fighting the wet-on-wet technique. You have to let the water do what it wants. We talked until 2 a.m. At some point, Pat called because she'd heard the settlement was done and wanted to know if we were celebrating. And Margot put her on speaker, and Pat said the news warranted a special session, and she was going to bring the good paper she'd been hoarding and her new sable brushes. And Sylvia texted in the background, "Tell her we're buying champagne for Thursday." And for a little while, my kitchen table in the apartment, the one that had been so quiet and so carefully organized, felt like it belonged to me. The divorce was final on a Thursday. It rained all day, which felt appropriately atmospheric without being overdramatic. A steady, working day kind of rain that didn't especially care about my proceedings and had other business to attend to. I signed the last documents in Ellen Marsh's office, and she shook my hand and said I had been the most organized client she'd ever worked with, which was the kind of compliment that, coming from a family law attorney who has seen the full range of human disarray, means something. I took myself to lunch alone afterward, at a restaurant I had mentioned to Clifton once and he had never remembered, and I ordered the good pasta and a glass of wine, and sat by the window and watched the rain. I thought about the parking garage, the granola bar, the 3 missed calls, and the dry cleaning, the way a pond goes still before it freezes. I had been in that moment for a long time without knowing it, sitting in the cold, becoming something with harder edges, something that could hold its ground. I raised my glass to no one in particular. The rain kept coming down, purposeful and unhurried, and I drank the wine, and it was not at all bitter. My mother came to visit in the spring, 4 months after the divorce. Her remission was solid, her doctor's word, solid, like something you could stand on. She brought tomato seedlings from her garden in a cardboard box, each one labeled in her handwriting, and she filled my apartment's small balcony with them within 48 hours of arriving. She was smaller than I'd remembered, and sharper, as though the illness had burned away everything optional and left only the essential. She looked around the apartment on her first evening and said, "It suits you better now." "It's the same apartment," I said. She was not looking at me. She was looking at the bookshelf, which I had reorganized after Clifton left, and at the chair he'd brought that I'd moved to a different corner, and at the watercolor paintings I'd finally hung on the walls, 3 of them, imperfect and vivid and unmistakably mine. "It suits you better," she said again. We cooked together that weekend. She called it cooking. I called it my mother commandeering my kitchen while I handed her things and was instructed in the correct way to mince garlic. We ate at the kitchen table, and she told me about her neighbor's dog, which had developed an inappropriate interest in the tomatoes, and about the debate she was having with her book club about whether a particular novel had redeemed itself in its final third or not. She said no. The majority disagreed. She considered the majority misinformed. She didn't mention Clifton once. On the last evening of her visit, she was sitting at the kitchen table with her tea, and I was washing up at the sink, and she said very quietly, "I knew." Knew what? That it wasn't right from fairly early on. The fruit basket. A small pause. He sent a fruit basket. He did. Your father used to do things like that, the gesture that looks right from the outside. She wrapped both hands around her mug. I didn't say anything because you hadn't asked me, and because you're the most capable person I know, and you were going to work it out yourself. I turned off the tap. I dried my hands. I looked at my mother at the kitchen table in her kitchen-annexed apartment, with the last of the evening light coming through the window and the tomato seedlings visible through the balcony door, small and green and stubbornly growing. You should have said something, I said. I know, she took a sip of her tea. I'm saying it now. It wasn't right. And you worked it out yourself, and I am very, very proud of you. I sat down across from her. We didn't say anything else for a while. The light faded, she finished her tea. The tomato seedlings threw small shadows on the balcony floor. The bracelet from my grandmother was on my wrist. I had worn it every day since I retrieved it from Dolores's house, and it was heavier than I remembered from childhood, and lighter than I'd expected. Margot called the next morning to ask if my mother was still in town and whether she wanted to come to Thursday painting. My mother said, I haven't painted anything in 40 years. And Margot said, perfect, you'll fit right in. And that Thursday, my mother sat at my dining room table, covered in newspaper, and painted what she called a loose interpretation of the tomato plants on the balcony. And it was genuinely the best painting of the evening, instinctive and joyful and completely untroubled by technique. Pat stared at it. I have been doing this for 2 years. Don't think about it, Margot said. I am absolutely thinking about it. My mother laughed. It was the best sound in the room. 6 months after the divorce, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Clifton had reached a plea agreement in the criminal matter. Reduced charges, restitution, no prison time, but a substantial fine and a permanent mark on his record that would make his current position untenable. He had left the firm by the time I heard this. He was, as far as I could tell, living with his mother while she recovered from her ankle. I imagined Dolores with her tea service and her ledger, accounting for his presence in her house the way she had once accounted for my Christmas gifts. I didn't feel satisfaction exactly. I felt the particular completeness of a column of figures that has finally balanced. Gerald, the parrot, I thought about occasionally. I hoped he was well. He had, in his way, testified on my behalf. There is a watercolor of mine hanging in my office now, framed above the desk. I painted it 6 months ago, one Thursday evening when the wine was good and the conversation was easy, and I wasn't thinking about outcome, only process. It's a study of light through water, abstracted, a little imprecise, blues and greens bleeding into each other in the way that watercolor does when you stop fighting what the medium wants to do. Margot says it's the best thing I've ever made. My mother has a photograph of it on her refrigerator. I got to work this morning and made coffee and sat down at my desk, and the light from the window fell across the painting and made the blues look like something you could swim in. My work email had 3 messages, 2 from clients, 1 from Ellen Marsh, who had referred a new client and wanted to know if I was doing forensic accounting consultations. I thought about it while I drank my coffee. I thought about discrepancies and records and the particular satisfaction of finding what doesn't add up and following it until it does. I wrote back, yes. The bracelet was on my wrist, lighter than I remembered and heavier than I'd expected, and exactly right. Outside the window, the morning was doing what mornings do, moving forward, unhurried, with complete indifference to what had come before and complete readiness for what would come next. I had been, at various points in the last few years, a woman who sat in parking garages eating granola bars, and a woman who photographed every page of a ledger on a closet floor. I had been the person who held the basin and the person who drove to gas station parking lots to make calls she didn't want overheard. I had been patient and methodical and carefully, quietly furious for longer than I would like to admit. I was also, now, the person who kept the apartment and the bracelet, whose mother was growing tomatoes in her garden with aggressive intentions, whose Thursday evenings smelled of wine and paint and the specific warmth of people who know you well enough to say the true thing without being asked. I was the person who had spent 12 years noticing discrepancies and had finally, decisively, turned that skill on the one account that mattered most. He priced me wrong, I thought, not for the first time, and he paid full cost. I opened the first client file. The numbers were, as ever, patient and honest and waiting to be read. I was very good at reading them. I had always been very good at reading them. The only difference was that now, when I looked up from the page and saw my painting on the wall and my mother's tomato seedlings in a pot on the windowsill she'd insisted on leaving, I felt something underneath the work that hadn't been there before. It was a quiet thing. It didn't announce itself. It felt like the difference between still water that's waiting for something and still water that has arrived somewhere and knows it. Outside, the morning kept going. The coffee was good. The light was very clear.